In the Middle Ages, the grandson of Genghis Khan planned his next invasion. The Mongols planned to send a massive fleet to invade Japan, but before they could do so, a massive storm devastated the fleet and saved the country. The priests would describe this storm as the Kamikaze, which means divine wind. Nearly 700 years later, as Japan once again faced invasion, a different type of divine wind was invoked. But this time, it was not a literal wind, but wind and waves of young men crashing their planes in suicide attacks. Today we will learn all about some of the most extraordinary military units of World War II, the Kamikaze. But for all their fanaticism, just how effective were these attacks? From diving onto US ships to smashing into US bombers, did the Kamikaze bravely deter invasion, or was it just a fanatical waste of life? This is Knowledge Voyage. In early World War II, Japan ran riot across the Pacific, seizing territory from Alaska to China to New Guinea. But this empire that touched 3 continents would not last long. After Japan's defeat at Midway in June 1942, the tide turned. America brought its stunning industrial capacity to bear and waged pitiless submarine warfare on Japan's supply ships. By 1943, the US was sinking 10 times the amount of shipping Japan could rebuild. American forces had also used island hopping, slowly making their way to Japan itself. Japan's soldiers had fought to the last man everywhere, but nothing seemed to stop America. It was now clear desperate action was needed, and that action was proposed by the so-called father of the Kamikaze, Takejiro Onishi. Onishi informed pilots of the 201st Air Group that they would be renamed the Kamikaze, a reference to an ancient Japanese poem written by the Emperor Jommu. On the great rock of the divine wind, Sea of Ise. The great shrine at Ise was where the Japanese wind god was worshipped, and prayers here in the Middle Ages had seen a massive typhoon wreck a massive Mongol invasion fleet. With Japan once again threatened with invasion, the Kamikaze was again invoked, but this time it would be the people that formed the wind and waves. Onishi split his unit into 4 units with poetic patriotic names like Yamato, Shikishima, Asaki, and Yamazakura. Pilots were told to use the Tai Atari or body crash tactic, whereby planes would crash into US ships and sink them. The goal was simple. The pilots would sacrifice their lives in suicide attacks and destroy so many US ships that the US would call off its plan to invade Japan and settle things diplomatically. Whilst there had been isolated individual suicide attacks in the Pacific War, it was now an organised, officially approved tactic. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, the first official kamikaze strikes were recorded. Japanese propaganda broadcasts boldly reported these suicide attacks had rattled the Americans. The reports convinced the few Japanese commanders unsure about the tactic to support it. It also triggered a wave of kamikaze volunteers, who can be broadly divided into 4. Firstly, men from old samurai and noble families. These men came from a long line of families who saw it as their duty to give their lives for the emperor. The second were face savers, young men who had felt personal shame at the sacrifice of the other Japanese troops and wished to emulate their courage. The third group were young graduates, and the final group were social misfits who saw no future for themselves in Japan. But some men were barred from kamikaze service. The eldest son in the family was exempt from kamikaze duty, as it was his role to carry on the family line according to Japanese custom. Men who were the only sons in their family were also exempt. Men with wives and children were barred from kamikaze service, although there are accounts of wives committing suicide to free up their husbands for kamikaze duty. But were the Japanese propaganda claims true? The kamikaze attacks did unsettle the US sailors, as watching planes purposefully ram you in suicide attacks was a tactic that shocked many. US Admirals Chester Nimitz and William Bull Halsey were so worried about the impact of kamikaze attacks that they banned the media from reporting them. The blackout was only lifted on the day Franklin Roosevelt died, and so the saturation coverage of the president's death drowned out reports of Japanese suicide planes. But the real question was, not were the attacks scary, but just how effective were these attacks in military terms. The kamikaze were having practical military impacts. US admirals found 1 in 4 kamikaze planes hit their targets, and 1 in every 33 was sinking a ship. Kamikaze impacts damaged the target in 3 ways. Firstly, the bomb that was often released just before the plane hit. Secondly, the plane itself striking the ship, tearing through armour. Thirdly was the burning aviation fuel, which would seep into the gaps in the ship's metal and often fill the ship's interior with smoke and fire. However, the military effectiveness of the kamikaze depended on several things. One of these was the nationality of the ship being attacked. For example, attacks on British ships tended to cause less damage than attacks on American ships. This was because British ships had metal decks, so could withstand more punishment than American ships, which often had wooden decks. A kamikaze damaged British ship could be ready to fight again after a few hours of repairs, whilst a similarly damaged American ship needed to return to a naval yard for full repairs. Kamikaze attack effectiveness was also blunted by US ships getting better and better at defensive measures. US planes stepped up patrols for kamikazes, and gunners on ships would often aim at the sea, knowing that jets of water could break up a kamikaze pilot's line of sight and make hitting his target harder. The Japanese attempted to overcome this by travelling in smaller groups to be less easy to detect. They also developed approaches where planes would fly as low as 10 metres or 30 feet from the sea level, well below US radar. To add to their ability to damage ships, the Japanese developed the Orca suicide plane. Closely resembling a missile, it would see a pilot climb onto the plane through the bomb bay of the mothership. He would then steer the rocket plane at a US ship. Around 50 Orca planes were sunk when the aircraft carrier they were on was hit by a US submarine, and had they made it to their targets, they may have killed many more Americans. There seemed to be a sharp decline in the kamikaze effectiveness in late 1944, and by late 1944, kamikaze attacks declined in number and quality. Large numbers of hastily trained kamikazes had been missing their targets altogether. Not just the quality, but the quantity of kamikaze attacks dropped, and the US believed it was because the Japanese were out of planes, but they could not have been more wrong. In actual fact, the Japanese were holding back planes in reserve as part of their Operation Shogo. This saw Japan's empire divided into 4 defensive zones, and kamikaze attacks would be launched as each one of the zones was breached by the advancing Americans. Before embarking on missions, an elaborate ritual would see sake wine being drunk by kamikaze pilots, and a belt made of 1,000 stitches, each stitched by one person, would be attached. Their planes would take off and would often fly to the most southern mountain of Japan they could find. Here, they would take one last look at their homeland and salute the sacred mountains. The Japanese master plan was called Ketsugo, which would have seen 10,000 kamikaze planes launched once Japan itself was under invasion. Had an American attack on Japan itself been launched, kamikaze pilots had been trained to engage differently. Out in the Pacific, the kamikazes had been trained to attack capital ships, especially aircraft carriers. But in preparation for Ketsugo, pilots were trained to aim at troop transport ships. This would have made kamikaze attacks far more casualty intensive. Furthermore, Allied radar would have been less effective near the island of Kyushu, where the Japanese had correctly guessed the US invasion would begin. This is because kamikaze planes could have been launched and hit their targets before radar had even detected them. These mass wave kamikaze attacks would aim to create mass human casualties, and the Japanese whole strategy was based on causing the US so many casualties they called off an invasion of Japan itself and settled for peace. It is well known that kamikazes targeted ships, but what is less well known is that they also targeted planes as well. In preparation to invade, US bombers were striking Japan around the clock. Usually, B-29 bombers flew too high to be intercepted. However, in November 1944, bad weather forced B-29s to a lower altitude, and at this altitude, Japanese planes could reach them and rammed into them, destroying them. From then on, General Yoshida, who was in charge of the air defences over Tokyo, ordered Japanese fighters to be stripped of armour and extra fuel so they could reach higher altitudes and ram the Americans. By the end of the year, 16 American B-29 bombers had been destroyed by these kamikaze interceptor rammers. Whilst it was a dramatic tactic, this was a relatively small dent in the US Air Force, and to lose a pilot in a suicide attack just to take down one bomber the US could easily replace was a wasteful ratio. This tactic was also unable to save Tokyo from the biggest conventional raid of the war, when 100,000 people were killed in a raid by over 300 American bombers. As it happened, a US invasion of Japan never went ahead because of the atomic bombs. Because the US never invaded Japan, the 10,000 plane-strong kamikaze mass raids were never launched. But when Japan surrendered, there was one last action for the kamikaze. Matomo Ugaki, who had been the planner who arranged for the mass kamikaze attacks, announced he felt responsible for defeat in the war. Ugaki stripped himself of all rank insignia and posed for a last photograph, holding a sword his friend Admiral Yamamoto had given him. This is the last photograph taken before the last ever kamikaze mission. Ugaki then climbed into his plane and flew off to attack the US fleet. Whilst he was shot down near Iajima Island, his attack was the last kamikaze action of World War II. The memory of the kamikaze, however, lives on. In 2007, the movie I Go to Die for You was released in Japan, and it was released internationally under the title For Those We Love. It tells the story of an elderly Japanese woman, recalling the time she spent with young kamikazes before their missions. It stoked tremendous controversy, which showed that perhaps now Japan was ready to talk about the kamikaze. It has to be said, its title track, Like a Wind, by the Japanese band Sense, is well worth a listen. But whatever happens, the kamikaze will always be remembered for their willingness to die for their country. And for the men who faced these attacks, it will be something they would never forget. Thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.